We're on, and let's go ahead and spend the rest of our time talking about ecology. Ecology comes from the Greek word oikos, which means a household. Ecology is the study of the household. Now, if you're talking about the laws of the household, that is economics, money and things like that, interact with their surroundings. And we can talk about ecology at different levels of organization. Population ecology would study the set of all members of a single species in one area. Community ecology refers to interacting populations of different species in one area. So if we're talking about my lawn, if lawn is even the word now, we could talk about the population of clover on my lawn. Or we could talk about the plant community of my lawn, which just means the clover and the dandelions and the crabgrass and the thistles and everything else that's growing there. All of the plants on my lawn together interacting with each other. If we talked about the ecosystem of my lawn, we'd be talking about all the communities and their abiotic surroundings. And abiotic means not living. So things like sunlight, the amount of water, rainfall, temperature, humidity, chemical makeup of the soil, things like that, those are not themselves living, but they're very important for the ecosystem. You wouldn't have plants without sun and water, for example. So we can talk about ecology of a population, of a community, of an ecosystem. A set of similar ecosystems around the world would be called a biome. So, for example, we could talk about temperate grassland biomes, which would include the prairies of Western North America and the pampas of Argentina and the spinifex of Africa, the savannas of Africa. All of those would be examples of a similar biome. Or we could talk about the coral reef biome, which would include coral reefs of everywhere from the Florida Keys to the tropical Pacific to the Red Sea to the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. We could talk about the cool temperate forest biome. Would include everything from the rainforest of Washington State to the taiga forest of Siberia, and so on. And then finally, all life on Earth we can talk about as the biosphere. The set of every last living thing on this planet makes up the biosphere. Right. Let's start with looking at populations, and we'll go back to an observation that Darwin made. If a population was able to grow and all of its members were able to reproduce at full capacity for their entire lifespans, and all members lived a full lifespan and didn't die until they were quite old, for whatever that means for a species, and there were no controls on it, a population would grow exponentially, meaning that it would double over a fixed time. If you started with 2, after a certain interval of time, you'd have 4, and then after another interval of time, you'd have 8, and then after another interval of time, you'd have 16, 32, 64, ... It would keep doubling. We call that exponential growth. And a graph of what that looks like is shown by this exponential curve, otherwise known as a J curve, because it looks a little bit like the letter J, I guess, if you're on drugs. Very, very, very briefly, I'm going to show you a math equation. Do not memorize it. You're not going to have to work problems using this. You won't have to solve this equation on the exam, but that curve is defined by an equation that looks like this. The population at a set time t, we just call nt, it's equal to the starting population, which is n sub 0, multiplied by e, which is an irrational number that begins 2.71828. That's a constant, to the power of the intrinsic rate of increase multiplied by time. That R right there is called the intrinsic rate of increase, and it expresses how steeply the population is increasing. If it's 0, the population is not increasing at all. Now, R in this equation is written lowercase, and it's not quite the same thing, but it's related to a number called capital R that is used in modeling infectious disease epidemics as a measure of how fast the infection is spreading and how many more people are getting infected. You remember hearing about, wearing masks and social distancing and staying indoors, and the idea was to flatten the curve. What they were trying to do was decrease that quantity that's written as capital R. And it's not quite the same thing mathematically, but it's related to the lowercase r that we're doing here, which is a measure of how steeply a population is increasing in number. It's a measure of whether this curve is shooting straight up like a rocket or growing more gradually and more slowly. The life cycle of a common fruit fly takes about 7 days from egg laid to sexually mature adult. If you started with a single pair of flies, in 1 year, you'd have a ball of flies the size of the earth. If you had 2 flies, male and female, and they mated, and the female laid eggs, and the eggs all hatched into maggots, which all had lots of food, and none of them had disease, and they all grew up to be new fruit flies, and they all mated, and they all had babies of their own. If you kept on going like that, in a year, you'd have a ball of flies the size of the earth. Bacteria are even better. A single bacterium under perfect conditions may be able to divide once every 20 minutes. And if you started with 1 bacterium and you gave it perfect conditions, the right temperature, all of the right nutrients, everything, just paradise for your bacteria, in something like a week, you would end up with a glob of bacteria. You'd have more bacteria than there are atoms in the universe. This obviously does not happen. There are lots of bacteria, but there are not more bacteria than there are atoms in the universe. So something happens to keep populations down. In fruit flies, it could be predators. Maybe there's spiders eating your fruit flies. Maybe it's people spraying pesticide. It could be disease. There are plenty of diseases that can afflict fruit flies. It could be just, inability to find a mate. Maybe some fruit flies just never get lucky. It could be starvation. Maybe your kitchen runs out of overripe bananas and you clean it really well so there's no more food for the fruit flies to eat. It could be a lot of things, but something, or usually a combination of factors, is going to act to keep populations down. And this happens in any population, be it fruit flies or elephants. When we look at a population in an ecosystem, we can talk about its carrying capacity, and that's the maximum number of individuals that can be supported stably in an ecosystem. And that's determined by both biotic and abiotic factors. So the number of fruit flies that can live in your kitchen is partly determined by biotic factors, which might be the presence of predators. If you've got spiders in your kitchen that will eat the fruit flies, the presence of parasites, the presence of food. the amount of overripe fruit that you've got lying around in the garbage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Abiotic factors might include the amount of light, the temperature. Fruit flies might do better at warm temperatures. So if your kitchen is really cold, fewer of them can live there. The amount of moisture available, the amount of oxygen that's present in the atmosphere, those are all abiotic factors. And of course, exactly which ones are important depends on what species we're talking about. And if we model population growth simply, what we usually see is that populations, if they're starting small, they'll grow and they'll rise and they'll start approaching carrying capacity. And as they do that, they begin to level off. And eventually they reach a kind of stable point. Now, at that point, the population is still growing. Individuals are still mating and reproducing. But what's happening here at that leveling off point is a point where the number of births is balanced by the number of deaths. Individuals are dying at the same rate that they're being born. And where that growth levels off, we have what's called logistic growth, not exponential. And this type of growth curve, the type of diagram we can draw to show how that population grows and then stabilizes, is called a sigmoid curve. Sigmoid means shaped like the letter S, okay, or technically shaped like a Greek letter sigma, but in context it means S-shaped. And you can see that that curve looks kind of like an S if you open it out a great deal. If you rotate it counterclockwise 45 degrees, it would look like the logo for Studebaker cars. Not that any of you young post-millennial whippersnappers remember those. Right. So sigmoid means S-shaped, and that describes this curve. And this type of growth, where you get rapid increase and then leveling off, is called logistic growth. So a population might increase and level off and reach the plateau phase, or it might increase, overshoot carrying capacity, and once it's overshot, the number of deaths rises and the population falls back down. So it could go boom, overshoot carrying capacity, and then get dragged back down. Or it might kind of zigzag around the carrying capacity. It might, overshoot and fall down and then shoot up again and then fall down and then bounce up again and so on. So in the real world, you can have more complex things than just a leveling off. But you can think of carrying capacity as being this line that if the curve overshoots the line, it'll drop back down. And by the way, this is spelled carrying capacity with a K, not to be cute, but in the equations that we use to describe population growth, the abbreviation for carrying capacity is capital K. So yeah, that's why they spelled it with a K, just to be adorable, I guess. But just to remind you that that's the abbreviation that we use. Population explosions can be pretty devastating when they happen. That's what the island of Madagascar looked like in 2013, when there was a colossal swarm of locusts that ate everybody's crops. There are just certain conditions when the locust population can reproduce extremely rapidly and vastly overshoot K and eat everything and then crash down. And incidentally, we can use the same basic math to model the course of epidemic diseases. I mentioned that lowercase r that we use for talking about COVID-19, for talking about epidemic cases, COVID-19 or otherwise, it's not quite the same thing, but it's like, okay, capital R is what we use for talking about disease. Lowercase r is a little different, but what they both refer to is basically the steepness of the increase of case number. And the cumulative number of cases of Ebola virus interactions between 2014 and 2016 look like this. It's also logistic growth. It's also, growth that starts out exponential and then begins to level off. And it started leveling off once the virus was no longer able to find new people to infect and started going away. This is what they're talking when they're talking about leveling the curve. This is what they're talking about. Okay, I probably should have updated this slide. This was the cumulative number of US cases of COVID-19, which back in April had barely begun leveling off. When we talk about flattening the curve, we mean reducing the rate at which that curve increases upwards. And again, capital R, when we model epidemics, is not quite the same thing as lowercase r, but it's the same basic idea. Obviously, with updated data, we did manage to level the curve for a while, and then it started shooting up again. And so we're currently in kind of a second peak, and we're trying to flatten the curve a second time and get it under control. Right, so that's a connection between what we're talking about now and ecological concepts. And I'm sorry, I'm just staring at the curve, and just, March 16th was about when we shut down classes in the middle of the spring semester, and we only had a minuscule number of cases in this country, and I'm just amazed at, sorry, I'm having a moment here. Let's move on. But when you start looking at communities, populations can influence each other, and they can do this in very complex ways. So let's look at the mammal community of northern Canada. We have very good records of this because the Hudson Bay Company in northern Canada buys animal furs from trappers and then, sells them what they need. And the Hudson Bay Company has kept records of the number of furs that they buy. Now, trappers don't manage to trap nearly anything close to every fur-bearing animal. They're only taking a relatively small sample of what's out there. So we can use the number of animal furs that are brought in as an estimate of the total population size. And in particular, we'll look at two species. On the right, we have Arctic hares, relatives of rabbits. In winter, their fur turns white, so they blend in with the snow. On the left, we have lynx, Canadian lynx, closely related to bobcats, which we have in Arkansas. Lynx are a little bit farther north. Lynx with very big paws for running on snow, and love to eat themselves some bunny rabbits. And we have records of the population size of lynxes and hares going back over 150 years, and they look like this. Both populations go through cycles of boom and bust. The hare population will rise, and then it will fall. And this graph shows that when the hare population goes down, the graph becomes a receding hairline. Right. Oh, boy. Anyway, so the hare population goes up and down, and the lynx population also goes up and down, and they both go through a cycle of roughly 9 years. Here's the kicker. Notice that the peak years of the lynx population is usually just a little bit after the peak year of the hare population. The rises and falls are not perfectly in sync. The peak of the lynx population is usually delayed a year or two after the peak of the hare population. So these populations are just a little bit out of sync with each other. And the reason is that the hares are the lynx's main food supply. So here is a lynx about to have dinner. Looking at those big paws for catching hares. So as the hares increase in numbers, hares mate and they have babies and they breed like rabbits. And the more hares there are, the more food there is for the lynxes. So when the hare population is growing, the lynxes get more food, they raise more kittens, and the lynxes become more abundant. But when the lynxes are abundant, they eat many more hares, and they eat so many hares that the hare population starts to fall. Okay, so lots of lynxes mean the hare population drops. When the hare population drops, that means there's less food for the lynxes. So the lynxes start, some will die of starvation. They may be able to raise fewer kittens in any given year. There may not be, enough food for mommy lynx to produce milk for lots of kittens. The lynxes become less abundant. I like this picture. But once you have fewer lynxes, the hares can now start increasing in number again. So you have these regular, stable cycles of population size in both hares and lynxes, driven by the lynxes preying on the hares, right? When the hare population goes up, the lynx population follows. But when the lynx population is high, the hare population drops, and that means the lynx population drops. But once there's few lynxes, that means the hares can reproduce more, and the hare population rises, and then the lynx population rises to follow, and so on. These two populations track each other with a time delay because of their predator-prey relationship. All right, just like this picture. Such a pretty kitty. It's what my cats would do if they could. So you can have predation as one thing that affects populations and communities. There can be other forms of competition that are more subtle. Here you've got trees in a forest. The trees are not actually fighting, right? The trees are not putting on boxing gloves and punching each other. I mean, unless they're Ents or something like that. Reminds me of the time I went to see the Two Towers, and when the Ents started marching on Isengard, I yelled, "Run, Forest, run!" And yeah, didn't win me any friends. But yeah, short of Ents, actual trees in our world don't go around beating each other up. But it is true that they compete for access to sunlight. Really tall trees block sunlight. Shorter plants get shaded out. Shorter plants have to live in the shade. There's less light for them. There's plenty of sunlight, but it's not infinite. There's only so much solar energy falling on every square meter of forest, which means that shorter trees and underbrush plants either die out or they have to adapt somehow to live with less light, both of which are things that you'll see in a forest. This is a view from the Mojave Desert, from probably Death Valley, and you're looking at little bushes called creosote bush, Laria tridentata, which smell like it, smell kind of like creosote or turpentine. And when you walk around, they're very evenly spaced, almost like they've been deliberately planted by a gardener, but they haven't been deliberately planted. It's just that for every bush that you see growing above ground, the roots are maybe 10 times as big, and the roots expand outwards in a circle under the surface of the soil, and they go down really deeply as well. And the roots are just so incredibly good at sucking up water that nothing else that grows close to a creosote bush can live. No other plant is going to survive very long if you plant it next to a creosote bush, because creosote bushes are just so good at getting water. And because of this, every creosote bush is surrounded by a dead zone that corresponds to the expanse of its own roots. And that's why they're spaced apart from each other and spaced very regularly. It's because of competition between creosote bushes for available water. And there's not very much of that because this is the desert. So that's another case of competition. competition can happen within members of the same species, which is what's happening here. It can also happen between members of different species. One of the things you have to bear in mind is that the carrying capacity of an environment isn't fixed. Living things act to modify the carrying capacity of its own environment. Simple example, soil starts out as bare rock, but as that rock weathers, as it's chemically broken down by the action of wind and water and ice, the rock starts breaking into pieces, and it may be chemically altered. But the other thing that makes soil is the buildup of organic matter, dead things incorporated into the soil. Ultimately, that's the difference between soil and just rock dust, the remains of living things. So if you imagine a tree growing in some very, very rocky soil, there may not be an awful lot of soil there, and maybe the tree doesn't grow really well. But if the tree grows, and as it grows, it'll shed its leaves, the leaves will fall under the tree, they'll rot, they'll get incorporated into the soil, and they'll make more soil. So one tree growing in very stony, rocky, shallow soil can actually build up more soil and end up producing soil that can support more trees. So a tree growing in rocky soil can actually increase the carrying capacity for trees. So an organism can make its own environment's carrying capacity go up. But humans are the greatest example of this. New farming methods, especially since the 1950s, pioneered by a gent from Iowa named Norman Borlaug, have increased the world food supply dramatically over the past, the Green Revolution over the past 70 years or so. But even before then, all through human history, people have developed new crops, new ways of plowing. They've taken more land into cultivation, and the world's food supply for people has increased dramatically, and that boosts the carrying capacity of humans. The world can support more people now than it could 100 years ago because people have acted to increase the carrying capacity of humans. The flip side of that is that, well, first of all, we've increased our own carrying capacity, but that sometimes comes at the expense of other species. The other problem is that because of ill-advised human activity, we're actually doing things that are pulling our own carrying capacity down. We've lost about 10% of the world's topsoil since 1945. And once you lose topsoil, you can't make it. It has to regenerate over a very long term. You can't build a topsoil factory. And things like that tend to drop the carrying capacity in many areas. One case where that's happened is here. That's Africa. Northern Africa, much of it is taken up by the Sahara Desert. South of the Sahara Desert, shown in orange, you have a belt of still dry but not actually desert land called the Sahel, extending from Mauritania in the west all the way over to Sudan and Eritrea and Ethiopia in the east. That orange-colored band of grasslands is called the Sahel. Now, people can make a living in the Sahel. It's dry, but there's enough grass that you can feed, goats and things like that. And traditionally, people living in the Sahel have been herders. The problem is that because of poor irrigation and also livestock overgrazing, too many goats and sheep and cows coming in and eating the grass, every year, 3,900 square miles of Sahel turns into desert. Imagine 6 Arkansas counties turning into desert every year. That overgrazing lowers the carrying capacity. If you have overgrazed land, you can't raise as many sheep or goats or cows or whatever you're raising, right? It gets harder to support a family or a village or any kind of human activity if you can't raise livestock. So the carrying capacity of humans in Sahel countries like Mali, Chad, and Niger, the carrying capacity is dropping. Human population is rising, and the upshot has been poor people who can't make a living on the land anymore flocking to the cities, which is causing massive urban growth, and that creates problems of its own. So this directly feeds into a social problem, the fact that human carrying capacity is not fixed, and some changes and choices that humans make tend to make the carrying capacity in an area go down, not up. Okay, right. Next thing. Organisms will tend to evolve towards one of two different life history strategies. What the heck is that? Well, a life history is basically everything that an organism does during its life. Feeding, reproducing, resting, avoiding predators, whatever it does. And organisms will tend to evolve different strategies. Organisms they're not literally thinking this over, but an organism has to, quote, decide, how much time and energy am I going to spend on finding food? How much time and energy do I spend on finding a mate? How much energy do I spend trying to avoid predators? Things like that. A life history strategy is a little bit like a household budget. Just like in your home, you have to decide how much money you're going to budget towards rent, food, Netflix, cell phones, whatever your pleasure is. You have to decide how much energy you're going to budget, how much money you're going to budget toward each of those areas. It's the same thing in organisms. Organisms budget different amounts of the energy that they've got towards different things that they have to do. And organisms don't consciously make that decision, but organisms evolve towards different life history strategies. And there are two basic types, although they're not the only ones possible. There's lots of in-between strategies. These are more ends of a continuum rather than either-or options. Organisms that evolve towards an R-selected life history, that it's called R-selected because R is that intrinsic rate of increase, right? R is basically how steeply that exponential curve shoots up. And organisms that are R-selected will produce many, 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 many offspring, but each parent invests little energy in each one. And that means that the vast majority of the offspring die. Most of the dying, the mortality, is done by the younger members. I'll show you a great example of this in just a minute. Another great example of R-selected life history, of course, would be pirates, because pirates have an R-selected life history. I'm imagining you all laughing right now. The other end of the continuum is a K-selected life history, and it's called K because it stands for carrying capacity. K-selected organisms tend to have very few offspring, but a great deal of investment of energy in each one. So a K-selected plant might produce very few seeds, but every seed has lots of nutrition inside it, to give the baby plant a really good start. An R-selected plant might produce tons of seeds, but there's not very much energy, not much nutrients in any of them. So most of the seeds are going to end up dying. Most of the mortality in a K-selected species is among the older members. That's an example right there of an R-selected species. That's a couple of oysters. And both oysters look like they're producing clouds of smoke. That's not smoke. That is millions of sperm on the right and eggs on the left, just being released freely into the water. When oysters spawn, they just fire off great big clouds of eggs and sperm into the water and hope for the best. Well, they don't really hope because they don't have brains, because they're oysters. They don't have much of a nervous system. But this is how they do it. They just synchronize firing off big clouds of gametes. The vast majority of the babies, the larvae that are produced, will die before they ever get to adult size. Many of them will just never, won't develop right. They may get eaten by other things. There's lots of critters in the ocean that would slurp up oyster larvae. Some of them will never find a place to settle down. Some of them will get devoured by predators when they're very young. Virtually all of those millions and millions of larvae will die before they reach adulthood. If memory serves, a female oyster can produce something like 10 million eggs in a season, and she might live for 20 years, assuming she's not pulled up out of the ocean and served on the half shell somewhere. So she might produce, what, 2 billion eggs in her lifespan. Almost none of them are going to make it. Only a couple of them might survive to become new oysters. That's very strong R selection. You emphasize quantity. Humans are polar opposites. We're a very strongly K-selected species, and most mammals are too. You know, humans cannot produce many millions of offspring. Judging from that reality show about the Duggars, 20 is probably kind of a hard limit for the number of offspring that a typical woman is capable of having, and most women have a lot fewer than that. So our reproductive rates are relatively low. We might only have, you know, somewhere between 1 and 10 offspring would be more typical. But humans invest a lot more energy in each offspring. We breastfeed, or we buy formula, but the old way of doing it is breastfeeding. And of course, all mammals do that. And that costs a lot of energy. For those that have not seen this, my wife used to just conk out like a light after feeding our son. It takes a lot of energy out of you. An anthropologist named Jared Diamond calculated that a woman nursing twins is burning as much energy as a soldier in basic training. And my observations are it tends to make you hungry and sleepy because it's a big energy investment. Of course, we invest a lot of energy in pregnancy because our, fetuses growing in the uterus take a lot of energy from the mother's body. And then after they're born, we invest a lot of energy in childcare. Whether that's lugging your kid around on your back or trying to find a daycare that won't ruin your budget, we invest a great deal, whether it's money or time or energy, or usually a combination of those, in every offspring. We invest a lot. Oysters invest very little, and most of them die. In many societies, child mortality is a problem, but still, if you get through infancy, you'll probably live to be fairly old. And most of our mortality comes at the end of life. And you can have in-betweens. It's not like every species is either one or the other. These are more two ends of a continuum. but many species can fall at various points in the middle. And as to which one is right or not, it all depends on what environment you're in. Oysters reproduce in ways that have worked for many millions of years for oysters. We reproduce in ways that work for us. Either one or something in between is going to be the optimum in different environments and different circumstances. And that's what organisms tend to evolve towards, whatever is optimal given the environment that they're in. And then every species has a set of conditions under which it will grow. And you can see this if you go to any store with a garden department. You could go to the plant outlet on Hogan Road. What a buy, what a buy. Or go to, Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that. And if you buy a plant, let's say you buy a tree for your yard, the tree will come with a tag telling you what conditions the plant needs. Such and such a tree might need full sunlight, at least 8 hours of sun a day, warm temperatures, and plenty of water. Or another plant might need plenty of water, but it will grow fine in partial shade. Or another one might be more shade tolerant, or another one might need lots of sun but not need so much water. And you'll find these little tags that tell you what are the best conditions to keep this very expensive plant you've just bought from turning into a heap of dead sticks in a few days. That set of conditions that's going to be written on the tag of the plant that you buy at the plant outlet, what a buy, is the species niche. And the niche is just the set of conditions under which a species will grow. We'd make a distinction between what we call the fundamental niche and the realized niche of a species. The fundamental niche is the conditions under which a species can grow, and the realized niche is the conditions under which it does grow, given that you have competitors. Whenever you have members of any two populations whose niches overlap, we have competition, because it means that those two populations are using the same resources. I'll try to clarify that fundamental versus realized niche thing in just a second. If you have two populations that share the same niche, one of two things can happen. One population might drive the other one out, and we call that competitive exclusion. Another thing that can happen is what we call resource partitioning. Organisms will change over time in such a way that they minimize niche overlap. Imagine a small Arkansas town not unlike Valonia. Let's say that everyone in Valonia wakes up ready to go to church or whatever you do in Valonia, probably not much else, and discovers that through some quirk of space-time, there are 20 shoe stores in Valonia. This is kind of strange because much of the population of Valonia is not too used to wearing shoes to begin with. Actually, I'm kidding. If anyone from Valonia watches this, I'm sorry. Got a lovely little town. But you probably don't have a big enough population to support 20 shoe stores in Valonia. You could think of all those stores as competitors, and they're competing for the same niche, which is, in this case, the number of people in Valonia who happen to want to buy shoes. So the number of shoe customers in Valonia is the resource that these 20 shoe stores that have mystically sprung up in Valonia, Arkansas, are competing for. One outcome is that, if there are not enough people in Valonia that want to buy shoes to support 20 stores, and I assume there aren't, one store might drive another store to extinction, right? Stores that have high prices and or poor quality or something like that won't be able to get any customers and will go out of business. That would be competitive exclusion. But it's also possible that stores might end up specializing, doing what they call market segmentation. So you might end up with one store that specializes in athletic footwear and one that specializes in, work boots or something like that, and one store that specializes in Louboutins or Jimmy Choos or whatever the heck it is, high-end shoes, fancy shoes for, Valonia High School prom or something like that. So some of those shoe stores would be driven out by competition, and that's like competitive exclusion. Others of those shoe stores might be able to divide the resource of people in Valonia that want to have shoes and end up sharing it over time, so they're minimizing their competition. That's an analogy for resource partitioning. Here's a great example of competitive exclusion. Was worked out in 1931 by a Russian biologist named Gauss. And he took two populations of single-celled protist. These are single-celled. They're covered in cilia so they can swim around. On the left, you have Paramecium aurelia. On the right, Paramecium caudatum. And when you grow them separately, you can grow these very easily in a little dish. And if you grow them separately, both populations will grow all the way to carrying capacity. They feed on bacteria and things like that, and they'll grow until they reach equilibrium. But when you grow both species in the same test tube, one species dominates and the other one goes down to extinction. That's some of his actual data. Over the course of 25 days, both populations grow for a while, but then one species, Aurelia, ended up dominating, and the other one, Caudatum, peaked and then drifted down and ultimately, given enough time, went extinct. That would be competitive exclusion. Niche partitioning, on the other hand, is something that's been observed in places like Canadian fir tree forests, conifer, cone-bearing tree forests. These are three different species of warblers, little songbirds, and they all live in the same trees. What has come to happen is that one species, the Cape May warbler, is best adapted to live in the tops of the trees and feeds on the insects that live up there. A second species, the bay-breasted warbler, is adapted to live in the middle of the trees. And a third, the yellow-rumped warbler, lives down at the bases. Each one feeds on different species of insects. Each one occupies different zones of the tree. And so the three don't compete with each other because they have divided up that niche. They have partitioned the niche into sub-niches. Or as an old professor of mine used to say, life's a niche and then you die. Right. Hardy har har. Okay. So that's where I want to leave you, with a knowledge of niches. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now. So there's that. And okay, I'm going to stop presenting and I'll stop the recording for now, and we'll pick this up on Wednesday.